Welcome back to day 4 of our 5-day devotion with the golden mouth preacher, St. John Chrystostom. Hey, I remember the first time that I ever rode a roller coaster. My whole life before that, I hated roller coasters. They were terrifying and honestly thought that if I just went, I was going to die. Well, eventually I went with a group from school and just friend after friend got on the roller coaster, went on it before me and said, look, you can do this. It is so much fun. You're not going to die. You are going to love it. And after enough people who kind of went ahead of me and told me it was going to be all right, I eventually went. Now, the first time I was on a roller coaster, yes, it felt like I was going to die. But I trusted my friends, I made it through, and in fact, I actually had a whole lot of fun. It's always helpful when you have people to go ahead of you, tell you how the experience is, and then reassure you that you can get through it yourself. Well, today, St. John Chrysostom is going to give us a person who has been through affliction, who's been through trials. Many of you right now, you're in the midst of fear and anxiety and worry, and it would be really helpful to hear of somebody who's been there before you. Well, St. John today tells us of someone who's been there, and his name is Jesus Christ. Listen to what St. John has to say about Jesus going ahead of us in the midst of suffering and affliction. He says this, "But whoso is in affliction and temptation, this man standeth near to him," talking about Jesus, "whoso is journeying on the narrow way. For he himself trod this, whence too he saith that the Son of Man hath not where to lay his head. So then grieve not when thou art in affliction, considering with whom thou hast fellowship, and how thou art purified by trials, and how great is thine gain. For there's nothing miserable save the offending against God, but this apart neither afflictions or conspiracies, nor any other thing have power to grieve the right-minded soul. But like as a little spark, if thou hast cast it into a mighty deep, thou presently puttest it out. So doth even a total and excessive sorrow, if it light on a good conscience, easily die away and disappear." Now look, I know that was a long quote and the old English translation doesn't help us understand it, but just let me break it down for you. Did you catch what St. John said at the very beginning of that quote? He said, if you are in affliction, if you're in suffering, if you're in worry, you're standing near to Jesus Christ himself, the God-man. He points out how Jesus, who's God, but who became a man, lived on this earth in poverty. In fact, Jesus said he had nowhere to lay his own head. Jesus didn't have a lot, and eventually he went and suffered and died on a cross. If you're in affliction and suffering right now, Jesus has been there too. He's gone ahead of you. He even went to a cross and suffered and died. Jesus knows what it means to be in suffering. So what do we do? St. John tells us 4 things that we need to do. First, he tells us, grieve not. Don't worry. Don't fret. Don't let anxiety and fear overtake you. Step 2, he says, think about who you're following into affliction. You're following Jesus. Jesus has been there. Jesus has suffered. Jesus has been through all of these terrible things, and he made it out. Step 3, think about how you are being purified by trials. That as you follow Jesus into trials, these trials are actually purifying you. They're making you better. They're growing you. And then finally, he says to think about our great gain. That as we follow Jesus into trials, as we're purified by trials, we actually begin to look more and more and more like Jesus by following him into affliction and into trials. So when we stop, he says this, don't fear, you're following Jesus, you're being purified by trials, and you're being made like Jesus through all of your affliction. So what does it matter if we go through bad times? What does it matter if it gets scary for a while? Watch what he says. Even a total and excessive sorrow, if put on a good conscience, will easily die away and disappear. You have got Christ. You've got a good conscience. You've got Jesus. You're being saved. As you go through these trials, you are working towards something eternal, namely being purified and looking like our Savior. That's something that's going to benefit you forever. So the fear, it's temporary. The worry, it's temporary. The losing your job is temporary. The wondering if I'll get sick is temporary. But looking like Jesus is something that is eternal. So what can all that stuff do to you? It only has a hold on you for a small amount of time. But going through this suffering, going through this worry is producing Christ in you, something that will benefit you unto salvation for all of eternity. So let's rejoice in the midst of this craziness. Let's rejoice in the midst of the affliction. It's actually helping us out, and not in a way that only lasts for a little bit, but in a way that lasts forever. So here's my question for you. Are your eyes fixed on the temporary and the temporal, or are your eyes fixed on Jesus and on the eternal? Have you spent most of your time worrying about how bad right now is? Or have you spent your time not fearing but rejoicing that this is actually producing something good in you? Here's my challenge to you. Wake up every day and be thankful that you're being purified like trials. You're following Jesus into trials. That if Jesus has made it out of suffering and received glory, you're going to make it through suffering and receive something better. Receive glory too. Be thankful today for the opportunity to work towards something eternal, looking like Jesus Christ, and have faith. If He's been through it, you can get through it too. I can't wait to see you tomorrow for day 5, the final day of our 5-day devotional with the Golden Mouth preacher, St. John Chrysostom. We will see you there.